What is actually rewarded for work, the legal what is actually rewarded for work, the legal title on the basis of which one demands a reward for it, is the mental expenditure of energy that is required in order to discipline oneself and overcome the internal feelings of constraint and aversion. Language well illustrates this state of affairs in that it characterizes both the external economic and the internal moral results of our action as earnings. For in the latter sense too this certainly already enters into the situation if the moral impulse has overcome the restrictions of temptation, egoism and sensuousness, but not if the moral action stems from a completely self-evident drive that, from the very outset, excludes the possibility of its opposite. Thus, in order for the moral ideals not to deny the moral earnings, the structure of myth among peoples everywhere allows their religious founder to conquer a temptation in every. Tertullian holds the glory of God to be greater si labra vit. Just as the real moral value connects with the restriction that is overcome in a contradictory impulse, so too does economic value connect in the same way. If man performed his work in the same way as the flower performs its flowering or the bird its singing, then no remunerative value would be attached to it. The reason for this lies not only in its external appearance, in the visible act and result, but also, in the case of physical labor, in the expenditure of will, in emotional reflexes, in short, in the conditions of the soul. Thus we gain the completion of the basic knowledge at the other end of the economic series, namely that all value and all the importance of objects and their possession lies in the feelings that they evoke, that their possession would be indifferent and meaningless as a mere external relationship if it did not include internal factors, emotions of desire, the elevation and expansion of the self. In this way the visibility of economic goods is limited from both sides, that of obtaining them and of enjoying them, by mental facts which alone ensure that an equivalent is demanded for the single achievement. However inessential and unconnected an object of possession that does not extend into a psychic emotion may be to us, it would be the suitable action for us if it did not arise out of an internally felt state of affairs whose aversion and sense of sacrifice alone bore within itself the demand for a remuneration and its measure. With reference to value, one can thus say that physical labor is mental labor. An exception to this could only be those forms of work that man accomplishes as a competitor to the machine or animals. For although these, like all others, conduct themselves in relation to internal exertion and the mental expenditure of energy, they nonetheless have no reason to improve in any way upon this internal achievement, since the only external effect that is important to them is also attainable through a purely physical potentiality, and cost-conscious production will never be rewarded so long as a cheaper one is possible. But at a slightly deeper level, perhaps this exception to the all-inclusiveness of the external may also be traced back through the soul. What is rewarded in the achievements of a machine or an animal is certainly the human achievement which is inserted into the invention, manufacture and control of the machine, and the rearing and training of the animal. Thus one can say that any human work is not rewarded in the same way as this physical subhuman work, but on the contrary the latter is, as it were, indirectly valued as mental human work. This is only a practical extension of the theory that ultimately we also interpret the mechanism of inanimate nature according to the feelings of strength and exertion that guide our movements. If we insert our own essence into the general order of nature in order to understand it in its context, then this is possible only because we already place the forms, impulses and feelings of our intellectuality in nature in general and connect the underlay and the cover inevitably in a single act. When we extend this relationship to the world to our practical question of whether to compensate the performance of subhuman energies only through the counter-performance of human achievement, then the basic borderline becomes visible between that human work whose reward rests upon its mental element and that which, because of the similarity of its result with purely external mechanical work, appears to reject this basis for its reward. One may therefore assert in very general terms that, from the standpoint of the value to be compensated, the distinction between mental and manual labor is not one between mental and material nature, that rather the reward is ultimately required in the latter case only for the internal aspect of work, for the aversion to exertion, for the conscription of will power. Of course, this intellectuality, which is, as it were, the thing in itself behind the appearance of work and which forms its interior value, is not really intellectual but resides in emotion and the will. It follows from this that it is not coordinated with mental labor but rather is its basis. For at first the objective content of the intellectual process, the result separated off from the personality, the demand for reward is produced not in it but in the subjective function guided by the will that it embodies, the work effort, the expenditure of energy that it requires for the production of this intellectual content. In that an act of the soul is revealed to be the source of value not only from the standpoint of what is taken up but also of what is achieved, physical and mental labor contain a common, one might say, morally value-grounding base through which the reduction of labor value as such to physical labor loses its philistine and brutal materialistic appearance. This is roughly the case with theoretical materialism, which acquires a completely new and more seriously discussable basis if one emphasizes that matter itself is also a conception, not an essence which, outside us in the absolute sense, stands opposed to the soul but which in its cognizability is completely determined by the forms and presuppositions of our intellectual organization. From this standpoint, on the basis of which the basic distinction between material and mental phenomena becomes a relative instead of an absolute one, the claim to search for the explanation of mental phenomena in the restricted sense in their reduction to material phenomena is much less unacceptable. Here, as in the case of practical value, the external must only be freed from its rigidity, isolation and opposition to the internal in order for it to form the simplest expression and unit of measure for higher intellectual things. This reduction may or may not be successful. Yet its assertion is at least compatible, in principle, with methodological demands and the fundamental composition of value. Differences in the utility of labor as arguments against labor money. These comments not only prove that the equivalent for work is exclusively related to the amount of muscular activity but also eliminate certain considerations that are commonly brought against this connection. Nonetheless, a difficulty is encountered which seems to me to be insurmountable. This has its origin in the quite trivial objection that valueless, superfluous work also exists. For the refutation, according to which one naturally subsumes under labor as the fundamental value only efficient work justified through its result, contains an admission that is fatal for the whole theory. That is, if valuable and valueless labor exist, then undoubtedly intermediate stages, amounts of labor undertaken also exist which contain some but not distinct elements of purpose and value. Thus, the value of a product which, it is presupposed, is determined by the labor invested in it is greater or smaller according to the efficiency of this labor. This means, however, that the value of labor is measured not by its amount but by the utility of its result. And here the method sought to deal with the quality of labor is no longer helpful. The higher, more specialized, more intellectual labor indeed implies, compared with lower labor, more labor. It implies an accumulation and concentration of exactly the same general labor of which crude and unqualified labor only represents, as it were, a larger dilution, a lower potentiality. For this distinction of types of labor was an internal one which allowed the question of utility to be left completely aside and one in which the utility of the labor in question was always presupposed to exist in it in increasingly similar amounts.